The wind carried the scent of pine and blood, a sickening perfume that clung to the back of Ilara's throat. Her lungs burned, each ragged gasp a betrayal, loud in the sudden, awful quiet that had fallen after the screams. She ran, her worn boots slipping on damp earth and fallen leaves, the forest a dizzying green blur around her. A branch whipped her face, drawing a fresh sting of pain, but she couldn't slow. Behind her, the orange glow of what was once her home, her life, pulsed against the darkening sky. They were close. She could hear the snap of twigs, the guttural calls that were not of her people. Terror, cold and sharp, clawed at her belly. She stumbled over an exposed root, her ankle twisting with a sickening crunch. A cry tore from her lips as she fell, sprawling onto the forest floor, the impact knocking the breath from her. This was it. The end of her desperate flight. Scrambling, she tried to pull herself up, to drag her injured leg, but it was useless. Heavy footfalls thudded nearby, stopping. Slowly, Ilara lifted her head. He stood over her, a silhouette against the dying light filtering through the canopy. Cherokee. His face, streaked with black and red paint, was a mask of grim intent. In his hand, a tomahawk, its polished stone head gleaming dully. Another warrior appeared beside him, younger, his eyes alight with a terrifying, eager fire. This one, Kale, grinned, a wolfish baring of teeth. He raised his weapon, a war club heavy with cruel purpose. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear tracing a path through the dirt on her cheek. She braced for the blow, for the searing pain, for the darkness. Her short life, her lost family, flashed before her. A silent prayer, a whimper. Then, a grunt. Not of effort from the descending blow, but of something else. A thud. Not the sickening impact she expected on her own flesh. Her eyes snapped open. The first warrior, Tyan, stood between her and Kale. Kale was on the ground, his war club skittering away, his face contorted in surprise and rage, clutching his wrist. Tyan hadn't even looked at her. His gaze was fixed on Kale, cold and hard as river stone. Tyan's tomahawk was still in his hand, but it was not raised against her. He spoke, a low rumble in Cherokee, words she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, a command, a rebuke. Kale spat a furious reply, but scrambled back, his eyes still burning with hate, now directed at Tyan as much as at her. Tyan then turned, just his head, his eyes meeting hers. They were dark, unreadable, like the deepest part of the forest at midnight. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought he would finish what Kale had started. Instead, he reached down, his hand, strong and rough, closing around her arm. He pulled her up, none too gently. Her injured ankle screamed in protest, but she bit back the cry. "You live," he said, his voice a low rasp, the English words heavily accented but clear. For now, terror did not leave her, it merely shifted its form, coiling tighter in her stomach. Spared from one death, for what? His grip was iron. He began to pull her through the undergrowth, away from the spot of her near demise, deeper into the woods, leaving Kale glowering behind them. The smoke from the burning settlement was thicker here, the path illuminated by its hellish light. She could only stumble along, her mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief, the warrior's unyielding presence the only certain thing in a world that had just violently ceased to exist. His silence was as terrifying as Kale's open malice. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, promised new horrors. His reasons were a mystery, a dark void into which her imagination cast the most dreadful possibilities. Yet, she was alive. That one, stark fact, warred with the certainty of her impending doom. Tyan dragged Ilara through the smouldering ruins of what had been a small, hopeful cluster of cabins. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burned wood and something else, something sickeningly sweet that she refused to name. Flames still licked at charred timbers, casting dancing, demonic shadows. The bodies, she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the images, the sounds of her neighbors' last moments. Other warriors moved through the desolation, their forms dark and purposeful as they sifted through the remnants, their voices occasionally rising in brief, sharp calls. Some paused to stare at Tyan and his captive, their expressions ranging from indifference to a dark curiosity that made Ilara's skin crawl. She saw Kale among them, his arm now bound, his eyes following Tyan with a venomous promise. Tyan seemed oblivious, his focus solely on moving forward. He found a nervous, riderless horse, its eyes wide with panic, tied to a leaning fence post that had somehow survived the inferno. With a series of low, guttural sounds, surprisingly gentle, he calmed the animal enough to untie it. Then, without ceremony, he lifted Ilara, her protests dying in her throat at the sheer strength in his arms, and set her atop the creature's bare back. He swung up behind her, his presence a wall of heat and unfamiliar scent, leather, sweat, wood smoke, and something wild, like the forest itself. His arm snaked around her waist, holding her secure, a grip that felt more like a manacle than a support. They rode away from the destruction, the sounds of the raid slowly fading behind them, replaced by the rhythmic hoofbeats and the rustle of the night woods. Ilara dared not look back. The first night was a blur of exhaustion and terror. Tyan led them deep into the forest, far from any trail she knew. He finally stopped in a small, hidden dell, screened by thick rhododendrons. He slid off the horse, then pulled her down, her injured ankle throbbing mercilessly. He tethered the horse, then, with swift, economical movements, gathered dry tinder and started a small, smokeless fire. He offered her water from a skin, it was cool and tasted faintly of leather. She drank greedily, her throat raw. Then, a piece of dried meat, tough and salty. She chewed mechanically, her stomach churning, but forced herself to swallow. He ate his own portion quickly, then sat a little distance away, near the fire's edge, his back against a tree. He began to sharpen a long knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic shink-shink the only sound besides the crackle of the flames and her own ragged breathing. Ilara huddled on the cold ground, pulling her torn dress tighter around her, shivering despite the fire. It wasn't just the chill of the night air. It was a deeper cold, lodged in her bones, the cold of shock and utter desolation. She watched him, this silent, painted warrior who held her life in his hands. His face, in the flickering firelight, was all harsh planes and shadows, his expression unreadable. She expected him to speak, to demand, to threaten. He did nothing. He simply sharpened his knife, his eyes occasionally flicking towards her, then back to his task, then out into the darkness beyond their small circle of light. He was a sentinel, a predator, a savior of sorts, all at once. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating. Every shadow seemed to hold a new threat. What did he want with her? Why had he spared her only to drag her into this wilderness? The questions echoed in her mind, unanswered, unanswerable. Sleep was impossible. She could only watch him, her fear a living thing, coiling in her chest, waiting. The days that followed melded into a grueling rhythm of movement and exhaustion. Tyan pushed them onward relentlessly, from before dawn until well after dusk. Ilara's world shrank to the ache in her muscles, the throbbing pain in her ankle, the gnawing hunger, and the constant, oppressive presence of the Cherokee warrior. The wilderness was vast, an untamed, indifferent entity. Mountains rose before them, cloaked in ancient forests, their peaks lost in mist. Rivers, cold and swift, barred their path, and Tyan would find a shallow ford or, if necessary, guide the horse through the current, his grip on Ilara unwavering. She stumbled constantly, her town-bred feet unaccustomed to the uneven terrain, her ankle a persistent agony despite the crude binding Tyan had fashioned from a strip of her petticoat. Each time she fell, he would pull her up, sometimes with a grunt of impatience, but without overt cruelty. His silence was a heavy cloak. He moved through the forest with an unnerving, almost supernatural grace, like a shadow, his senses preternaturally alert. He found water where she saw only dry earth, identified edible roots and berries that looked like poison to her untrained eye. He would share these meager finds, ensuring she ate, though he himself often took less. Her attempts at communication were met with stony silence or a single, dismissive gesture. "Where are you taking me?" she'd ask, her voice hoarse from disuse and fear. He would merely point ahead. "What will you do with me?" only the impassive stare of his dark eyes answered. One evening, as the sun bled crimson through the trees, her endurance finally gave out. Her leg buckled, and she collapsed onto the damp ground, sobs shaking her frame. "I can't," she choked out, the words raw with despair. "I can't go on." Tyan stopped, looked down at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the fading light. She expected him to drag her, to strike her, to leave her. Instead, he unslung his pack, gathered firewood with his usual quiet efficiency, and built a small fire. He then took a tin cup from his pack, filled it with water, and added a handful of dried leaves. He set it near the flames to warm. When it was ready, he handed it to her. The brew was bitter but warm, and it soothed the raw ache in her throat. She drank it slowly, huddled by the fire, the warmth seeping into her chilled bones. The small, unexpected kindness was almost more unnerving than his previous indifference. Gathering what little courage she had left, she looked at him, truly looked at him, trying to find some flicker of humanity in his stoic face. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely audible. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the dancing flames, his profile stark and unyielding. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. Then, so low she almost didn't hear it, he spoke. The living walk. It wasn't an answer, not really. It was a statement, as immutable as the mountains around them. But it was something. A crack in the wall of silence. It didn't lessen her fear, but it added a new, unsettling layer of confusion to it. This man was a riddle, wrapped in paint and leather and a sorrow too deep for her to comprehend. Their solitary journey was interrupted a few days later. As they followed a narrow game trail along a ridge, 3 figures emerged from the trees ahead, blocking their path. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. Cherokee! And she recognized the leader instantly, Kale. With him were 2 other warriors from the raiding party, their faces grim, their eyes hard as they looked from Tyan to Ilara. Kale's arm was still bound, but he carried his war club with an air of renewed menace. He stepped forward, his gaze burning into Tyan. "She should be dead," Kale said, his voice a venomous hiss, the Cherokee words sharp and angry, though Tyan had begun to use sparse English with her, perhaps for Kale to understand his claim. Ilara understood the tone, if not all the words. Or a slave, for any warrior who wants her. Why does she still breathe freely, Tyan? Why does she ride while we walk? Have you grown soft? Does a white woman's pale skin cloud your judgment so easily? The other 2 warriors murmured, their expression suggesting they shared Kale's sentiment. Ilara shrank back, instinctively trying to hide behind Tyan's broader frame, though she was still on the horse and he stood beside it. Tyan remained impassive, his body relaxed but alert, like a panther about to strike. His eyes, however, were like chips of flint, cold and dangerous. He let Kale finish, the silence stretching taut. Then he spoke, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "She is my captive," he stated, his English clear, perhaps for her benefit, or as a deliberate assertion to Kale. "By right of war. I claimed her when you would have butchered her without honor. I decide her fate." He subtly shifted his stance, his hand resting near the handle of his tomahawk. "The spirits witness my claim when I struck you down from your foolish rage." He nodded towards Kale's injured arm. Kale spat on the ground. "Your claim stinks of weakness, Tyan. You shame our traditions. The elders, the council, they will hear of this. They will see the rot you bring. You walk a dangerous path, brother." His use of the word brother was laced with sarcasm and contempt. Tyan's expression didn't change. "The path is mine to walk. Yours leads only to more graves, Kale. Graves for their people, and graves for ours." For a moment, Ilara thought they would fight. The air crackled with unspoken violence. Then Kale gave a curt nod to his companions. "We will see whose path the spirits favor," he sneered, before turning and disappearing back into the trees, his followers close behind. The threat lingered, heavy and unspoken. Ilara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Tyan, seeing not just the stern warrior, but a man standing against his own kind, for reasons she couldn't fathom. He was protecting her, not just from the dangers of the wilderness or from other white men, but from factions within his own tribe. The realization added another layer to her fear, but also a fragile, nascent flicker of something else, a reluctant, terrified gratitude. Tyan said nothing, merely nudged the horse forward, his gaze sweeping the surrounding forest, his vigilance redoubled. The encounter had clearly unsettled him, though his stoic demeanor betrayed little. Elara understood then that their journey was not just about escape, it was about Tyan's own perilous gamble. A storm broke with sudden, terrifying fury. One moment the sky was a bruised purple, the next it was torn open by a deafening clap of thunder, and rain lashed down in solid, blinding sheets. The wind howled through the trees, ripping leaves from branches, turning the forest into a chaotic, roaring nightmare. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the deluge in brief, stark flashes. They were caught exposed on an open hillside. The horse, spooked by the thunder, reared and plunged, nearly unseating Elara. Tyan fought to control the animal, his voice a low, urgent rumble against the storm's violence. He finally managed to lead it towards a shallow rock overhang he'd spotted, a meager shelter against the elemental rage. It was cramped, barely enough room for them and the trembling horse. Tyan pushed Elara into the driest spot, further under the dripping rock, while he stood more exposed, the rain plastering his dark hair to his skull, running in rivulets down his painted face. She huddled, shivering uncontrollably, her thin dress soaked through in seconds, offering no protection against the bone-chilling wind. He seemed indifferent to the cold, a stoic figure against the tempest. The storm raged for hours. When it finally began to abate, leaving behind a dripping, battered world, Tyan went to check the snares he'd set earlier. Elara watched him go, his movements stiff. He returned empty-handed, and as he climbed back over a slick, moss-covered log near their shelter, his foot slipped. He fell heavily, his arm striking a jagged edge of rock. A sharp cry, quickly stifled, escaped him. Elara saw him examine his forearm, a dark stain was already spreading on his leather sleeve. It was a deep gash. He tore a strip from his shirt and bound it crudely, his face tight with pain. Elara hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to stay small, unnoticed. But seeing him wince, seeing the blood, something shifted within her. Her mother had been skilled with herbs and healing, a knowledge passed down, and Elara had paid more attention than she'd realized. She remembered her mother tending to injured farmhands, to her own father after accidents. Taking a deep breath, she pushed herself forward. I know a little about wounds, she said, her voice barely a whisper, half expecting him to snarl at her or push her away. He looked up, his dark eyes narrowed, suspicious. He studied her face for a long moment, then, to her surprise, gave a curt nod. Her heart pounded. Carefully, she approached. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his arm. He extended it. With trembling fingers, she gently unwrapped the makeshift bandage. The cut was long and bleeding sluggishly. "It needs cleaning," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She used her own dwindling supply of clean water from her canteen and a piece of her petticoat she tore off, a sacrifice, given her few possessions. He watched her every move, his expression unreadable, but he didn't pull away. She remembered her mother saying certain leaves helped stop bleeding and prevent festering. She looked around, and spotted some broad, fuzzy leaves growing near the base of their shelter, plantain, her mother had called it. "These might help," she said, holding one up. He glanced at it and grunted, a sound she was beginning to interpret as acknowledgement, perhaps even approval. She crushed the leaves between two stones, creating a rough poultice, and carefully applied it to the wound before rebinding it with a cleaner strip of cloth. Her touch was tentative, but her hands, surprisingly, were steady. Throughout the process, he remained silent, enduring her ministrations without flinching. When she was done, she sat back, suddenly aware of their proximity, the shared intimacy of the moment. He flexed his fingers, then looked at the bandage, then at her. Another grunt, deeper this time. It wasn't thanks, not in words, but it was something close. She didn't flinch from his gaze this time, a fragile understanding had passed between them, unspoken, in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The uneasy truce of the wilderness was shattered when Tyan found the tracks. shod horses, several of them, moving with purpose. Settlers, he'd grunted, his eyes hardening. Militia, most like. Captain Thorne, Ilara thought with a fresh wave of fear, remembering the ruthless, cold-eyed man who led the local defense force, known for his brutal efficiency and hatred of all native peoples. From that moment, their journey became a desperate flight. Tyan pushed them harder, his vigilance absolute. They traveled mostly at night, resting in carefully chosen, hidden spots during the day. Ilara, her ankle now stronger though still tender, learned to move with a silence she wouldn't have thought possible. She learned to read Tyan's subtle cues, a tilt of his head, a hand gesture, the sudden tension in his shoulders. She learned to listen to the forest, to distinguish the natural sounds from those that might mean danger. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was now sharpened by a sense of urgency, a shared purpose, survival. One cold night, huddled by a tiny, almost smokeless fire tucked deep within a rocky crevice, the silence between them felt different. It was less the silence of captor and captive, more of two souls thrown together against a hostile world. Ilara, emboldened by a strange mixture of exhaustion and a dawning, reluctant trust, found herself speaking. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, as she told him about her home across the ocean, the long voyage, the dreams her family had carried to this new, wild land. "My father, he just wanted a small piece of land," she said, her voice catching. "A place to build, to grow things. My mother planted roses, even here. They were just starting to bloom." She paused, the grief a raw ache in her chest. "They weren't bad people. They didn't hate your people. They just wanted to live." She didn't expect a response. Tyan rarely spoke of himself. He sat across the small fire, his injured arm cradled, his gaze fixed on the flames. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, making his expression even more inscrutable. For a long time, the only sound was the sigh of the wind through the rocks. Then, his voice, low and rough, broke the stillness. "My village burned too." Ilara looked up, startled. "Long ago. Before your roses bloomed." He paused, and she saw a flicker of ancient pain in his eyes, a pain so profound it seemed to suck the air from their small shelter. "My son, he was small. My wife, she fought like a wolf." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He shifted slightly, and the firelight caught a faded, puckered scar on his unwounded forearm, running from wrist to elbow. "White man's fire," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet conveying a universe of loss. It was the most he had ever revealed, a glimpse into the abyss of his past. Ilara felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy, so intense it was almost painful. Their griefs were different, yet a common thread of devastating loss wove between them. She saw not just the Cherokee warrior, the stoic protector, the feared enemy, but a man who had suffered as she now suffered. Captain Thorne's men were getting closer. They'd seen the distant, telltale glow of their campfires the previous night. The brief, fragile moment of connection was overshadowed by the pressing, lethal threat. The days that followed were a masterclass in evasion, Tyan's skills pitted against the relentless pursuit of Thorne's militia. He moved with an almost preternatural understanding of the land, covering their tracks in ways that seemed impossible to Ilara. He would lead them through shallow streams to break their scent, choose paths over hard rock that left no trace, double back on their trail to confuse their pursuers. He taught Ilara to listen to the birds, explaining how their alarm calls could signal approaching danger. He showed her how to read the wind, how the slightest disturbance in the undergrowth could tell a story. Ilara, driven by the primal instinct to survive, absorbed his lessons with a desperate focus. She was no longer a helpless burden. Her smaller frame and lighter weight allowed her to navigate dense thickets he might have struggled with. Her eyes, now sharpened by constant vigilance, sometimes spotted things he missed, a broken twig out of place, a disturbed patch of moss, the faint, distant shimmer of light on a rifle barrel. She would point these out silently, and he would acknowledge her observation with a curt nod, a flicker of something that might have been respect in his dark eyes. They shared their meager rations, dried meat, foraged roots, the occasional small animal Tyan managed to snare. The silence between them had transformed. It was no longer born of fear or mistrust, but of a shared understanding, a grim companionship forged in the crucible of their flight. They communicated in nods, gestures, and the occasional low-murmured word. Ilara found herself anticipating his needs, his movements, as he did hers. One evening, from the concealment of a high, wooded ridge, they watched the distant campfires of Thorn's men spread out across the valley below. There were more than they had initially thought. Too many, Tyan murmured, his voice a low rumble beside her. Ilara felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the crisp night air. "What will we do?" she whispered, the question more a plea than an inquiry. She didn't expect a detailed plan, but she had come to trust his resourcefulness, his ability to find a way when all seemed lost. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze sweeping the rugged line of mountains that rose to their north, their peaks silhouetted against the star-dusted sky. His eyes finally settled on a dark, forbidding cleft in the rock face, a narrow, treacherous-looking pass. "They will not follow easily there," he said, his voice grim. "The way is hard." "For us, too." Ilara looked at the pass, then back at the ominous glow of the campfires. There was no choice. Only forward, into the unknown, with this warrior who had, against all odds, become her unlikely guardian. The pursuit had stripped away everything but the raw essentials, survival, and a fragile, unspoken reliance on each other. The mountain pass was a treacherous ascent. Loose scree shifted underfoot, threatening to send them tumbling into the abyss that yawned beside the narrow, crumbling ledge they picked their way along. The wind howled through the jagged peaks, cold and biting. Ilara, her heart pounding in her chest, kept her eyes fixed on Tyan's back, mimicking his careful footfalls, his deliberate placement of hands for balance. Thorn's men, as Tyan predicted, were initially hesitant to follow into such perilous terrain. But a smaller, more determined group, led by the relentless Captain Thorn himself, pressed on, their distant shouts echoing eerily in the desolate landscape. Ilara could feel their pursuit like a physical weight on her back. As they neared what seemed to be the summit, a narrow defile between towering rock faces, figures emerged from the shadows ahead, blocking their path. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. It was Kale, and with him, a handful of his most ardent followers, their faces grim, weapons ready. He had tracked them, or perhaps Thorn had somehow communicated their route. Or maybe, Ilara thought with a sickening lurch, Kale had deliberately led them into this trap. "Nowhere to run, Tyan," Kale sneered, his voice echoing off the rock walls. He gestured towards Ilara with his war club. "The white woman. Give her to us. She has caused enough trouble. Or you die with her." Here, forgotten by the spirits behind them, Ilara could hear the sounds of Thorn's men closing in, their voices clearer now, punctuated by the metallic click of rifles being readied. They were caught. A pincer movement, with no escape. Tyan reacted instantly, pushing Ilara roughly behind a jagged outcrop of rock. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes blazing. He drew his tomahawk and knife, his body coiling with readiness. "Kale," he called out, his voice ringing with contempt. "You would ally with them? With the very men who burn our villages and steal our lands?" He gestured with his chin towards the approaching sounds of Thorn's militia. Kale's lip curled. "She is an enemy of our people, Tyan. You protect an enemy. That makes you an enemy. Their fight is not mine, but your foolishness ends today." Captain Thorn and 3 of his men appeared at the entrance to the defile behind them, rifles leveled. Well, Thorn drawled, a cruel smile playing on his lips as he took in the scene. "Looks like the savages are settling their own scores. Saves us the trouble." His eyes, cold and merciless, fixed on Tyan, then flicked to where Ilara was partially hidden. "Don't worry, girl. We'll take care of you." After Tyan stood alone between 2 hostile forces, a lone warrior against impossible odds. Ilara pressed herself against the cold rock, her body trembling, her mind reeling. But amidst the terror, a new, unfamiliar emotion stirred, a fierce, protective anger on Tyan's behalf. He had saved her. He had shown her a different path. She would not let him die like this. The air exploded with violence. Kale's warriors surged forward, their war cries echoing in the narrow pass, while Thorn's men opened fire from behind, their bullets whining off the rocks, kicking up dust. Tyan moved with a speed and ferocity that belied his lean frame and his previous injuries. His tomahawk and knife became extensions of his will, a blur of deadly motion. He met Kale's charge, deflecting a blow from the war club, his knife darting out to score a shallow cut on Kale's arm. He was outnumbered, caught in a desperate melee, but he fought with the courage of a cornered wolf, his movements economical, precise, deadly. He was trying to create an opening, a path for Ilara, but the space was too confined, the enemies too many. A Cherokee arrow, shot from the side, thudded into Tyan's shoulder, close to his neck. He grunted in pain, staggering for a moment, but recovered, tearing the shaft out with a grimace and flinging it aside. A bullet from Thorn's rifle grazed his leg, drawing blood, making him stumble again. Ilara watched in horror, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. She saw Kale, his face contorted with hate, raise his war club, preparing to deliver a crushing blow to the wounded Tyan. In that instant, something snapped within Ilara. The fear remained, but it was overwhelmed by a desperate, surging courage. She wouldn't cower. She wouldn't watch him die. She screamed, a raw, wordless sound of fury and desperation, and snatched up a loose, heavy rock from the ground. With all her strength, she hurled it at Kale. It struck him on the side of the head with a sickening thud. Kale roared in pain and surprise, his war club faltering, his attention momentarily diverted. It was only a second, but it was enough. Tyan, seizing the opportunity, lunged forward, not to kill, but to disarm, his tomahawk hooking Kale's club and wrenching it away, his knife pressing against Kale's throat in a clear, final warning. Kale froze, his eyes wide with shock and grudging respect. Captain Thorn, seeing his chance with Tyan momentarily engaged, took careful aim at the Cherokee warrior's exposed back. Ilara's mind raced. She remembered the small pouch of dried plants at her belt, irritating herbs her mother had warned her about, plants that, if burned, produced an acrid, choking smoke. With a desperate prayer, she fumbled for the pouch, tore it open, and threw its contents onto the small, wind-whipped fire that one of Thorn's men had foolishly kindled for warmth near the mouth of their side of the pass. The dried herbs caught instantly, sending up a plume of thick, eye-stinging, throat-burning smoke directly into the faces of Thorn and his men. Coughs and curses erupted. Thorn, momentarily blinded and choking, fired wildly, his shot going wide. His men stumbled back, rubbing their eyes, their ranks thrown into disarray. Now, Tyan yelled, his voice hoarse. He shoved Kale violently away, then grabbed Ilara's arm, pulling her towards a narrow fissure in the rock wall she hadn't noticed before, barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. The fight was still raging behind them, a confused cacophony of shouts, gunshots, and the clash of weapons, but for a precious few seconds, they had an opening. They scrambled through the narrow fissure, Tyan pushing Ilara ahead, his wounded body shielding hers from any stray shots. The passage twisted and turned, dark and claustrophobic, then opened abruptly into a steep, narrow ravine hidden from the main pass. Tyan knew this place. He half-carried, half-dragged Ilara downwards, his breath coming in ragged gasps, blood streaming from his shoulder and leg, leaving a dark trail on the rocks. The sounds of the fight faded behind them, replaced by the rushing sound of water. He led her towards it, towards a curtain of falling water cascading down a sheer rock face. Behind the waterfall, almost invisible, was the dark opening of a cave. Ilara helped him through the cold spray, into the damp, echoing darkness. He collapsed just inside, his strength finally deserting him. She gently lowered him to the cave floor. He was pale, his breathing shallow. His buckskin shirt was soaked with blood. Panic threatened to overwhelm Ilara, but she fought it down. He needed her. She was his only hope now. With trembling hands, she tore strips from her already ragged dress and petticoat. She carefully cut away the fabric around his shoulder wound. The arrow had gone deep, but thankfully seemed to have missed vital arteries. Cleaning it with the last of their water was agonizing for him, but he bore it with stoic silence, his eyes closed, his jaw clenched. She packed it with more of the plantain leaves she'd gathered earlier, hoping they would staunch the bleeding and fight infection. The bullet wound on his leg was less severe, a deep graze, but also bleeding profusely. She cleaned and bandaged that too, her earlier practice on his minor arm injury now proving vital. It was a long, terrifying night. Tyan drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering in Cherokee, his body burning with fever. Elara stayed by his side, bathing his forehead with cool, damp cloth, whispering words of encouragement, though she doubted he could hear her. She talked about her home, her mother's roses, anything to fill the silence, to keep the despair at bay, to keep him tethered to life. Towards dawn, after what felt like an eternity, his breathing seemed to ease. The fever broke. He opened his eyes, his gaze clouded at first, then focusing on her face, tear-streaked and smudged with dirt and his blood, but watchful. "You?" he rasped, his voice weak. "You saved me." Elara managed a shaky smile, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. "We saved each other," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. A long silence settled between them, filled with unspoken understanding, with the weight of all they had endured. He slowly raised his uninjured hand, his fingers brushing hers where they rested on his arm. It was a fragile touch, fleeting, yet it conveyed more than words ever could. A connection forged in terror, in shared pain, and in mutual acts of courage and compassion. They were outcasts, wounded and weary, their future an unknown, terrifying expanse. The wilderness stretched before them, vast and indifferent. But Elara was no longer the terrified girl who had braced for death. She had faced it, repeatedly, and in doing so, had found a strength she never knew she possessed, an empathy that transcended fear and prejudice. And Tyan, the stoic warrior, the enemy, had found someone who saw the man beneath the paint, who had risked her own life for his. He had chosen mercy, and in return, had received it. A flicker of hope, fragile but persistent, ignited in the damp chill of the cave. She had been changed forever, not by an enemy's expected blow, but by an enemy's unexpected, world-altering act of humanity, and the perilous, transformative journey that had followed. They did not face the wilderness entirely alone.